Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. When I was probably in second or third grade, we had an early dismissal. For those of you who don't know, that's when school goes on for longer than half a day, but we still get out an hour or so early. I remember sitting silently in class working on some math problems when the phone rang. I joked to my friend next to me that I hoped it was for me. We all watched the teacher answer the phone because we knew that 90% of the time it meant someone was leaving class. When the teacher's eyes met with mine, suddenly I got pretty worried. I was an anxious kid, so immediately I thought someone must have died. My teacher said something into the phone and then asked me, "When are you getting off the bus today?" I thought this was a pretty weird question. My mom already knew when I would be getting home because she had to leave work early, so she'd be there when I got there. I told my teacher the normal time. My teacher spoke for a few more seconds, then hung up the phone. I asked her what that was all about, and she told me my parent just wanted to double-check what time I got off. I didn't really think too much about it for the rest of the day. Later on, when I got off the bus, I walked home without much incident. When I walked to the front door, my mom asked me about my day and took my coat. I remember the exact look on her face when I asked her, "Why did you call the school to see what time I was getting off the bus?" She looked shocked. She said she hadn't called the school. I told her the whole story, and immediately she started making frantic phone calls. I knew right away something was wrong. I sat down and watched some TV while my mom talked up a storm. About 20 minutes later, my stepdad arrived home early from work. About 10 minutes after that, a state trooper pulled up as well. I was pretty scared at this point. I thought somehow I was going to be in trouble. The trooper asked me a few questions, such as, "Has anyone ever tried to talk to you while you've walked from the bus stop? Have you ever seen anyone park there who didn't have a kid get into their car? Has anyone ever tried to give you a ride?" The answer to all these questions was no. I'd never seen anyone suspicious, as we lived in a pretty nice neighborhood, and it was mostly old, retired folk who lived around us. My mom asked me to go upstairs and pack a bag, as it was my dad's weekend for visitation. When my dad got there to pick me up, he was questioned pretty heavily by the trooper as well. I eavesdropped from upstairs. My mom called me back down, and I left with my dad for the weekend. My dad taught me some basic self-defense, which I thought was pretty cool. I never heard anything else about the situation. Eventually, I forgot about it. Fast forward to today. I had been listening to some creepy narrations on YouTube when I suddenly remembered this whole incident. I asked my mom about it, and what she told me chilled me to my core. She told me that day, someone had called the school, pretending to be my dad. This man knew my dad's full name, my full name, and all the details about my mother as well. He kept on saying my mother had told him to pick me up from the bus stop, because she wasn't going to be able to leave work early. The school didn't even bother calling my mother. The only thing that saved me that day from being abducted was the fact I had told that man I'd be getting off the bus at the normal time, which was around 3:15, but because it was a shorter day, I actually got off the bus around 1:45. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, but it still gives me nightmares. At the time, I was attending a college that was only about a 10-minute walk away from my Nana's apartment. In between classes, I would walk over to visit her because of this. This was in a fairly sketchy part of town, so I would dress barely frumpy, sweatpants, an oversized sweatshirt, and always keeping my hood up and covering my face. I figured if I wore nothing attractive or flashy and was as plain as possible, I'd give off the message of "don't bother me." My mistake was thinking that in the middle of the day, no one would try to do anything. I wasn't calling attention to myself, so I figured I'd be practically invisible. But boy, was that wrong. I was just leaving her house and heading back to campus when I noticed this plain blue van slowly driving right next to me. It was a man who seemed to be asking me directions to a well-known hotel that had giant signs posted all over the side of the road. I didn't answer him because of this and instead kept my head down, walking a bit quicker away from his car. At that point, I saw him pull into the parking lot near us, turn his car off, and hop out. Now he ran up to me, walking next to me. He said I was pretty and started asking me the usual questions. What's your name? Know any places to party? Why are you being so shy? Don't you need a ride? I don't know why I decided to do this. I probably thought if I acted like I was real tough, he would just leave me alone. I stopped walking, turned around, and looked him in the face. I said, "Take a hint, you bastard. If I'm not answering you, it means leave me alone." The look he gave me in that moment sent chills down my spine. His eyes grew extremely wide, and he looked at me with this expressionless face. In a cold, emotionless tone, he said, "Okay, little girl, we'll see." He walked away, staring at me the whole time. I saw him jump in his car, only to fly out of the parking lot in the opposite direction. I felt a bit relieved, seeing as how I'd seen him drive away, and continued on my route. As I was crossing the road, though, the same van came screeching towards me. He drove up onto the sidewalk right in front of me, nearly running me over and blocking my path. "Get in the van. Now." I was frozen in fear. I was terrified and in shock. I stood there, telling myself to run, but my legs felt like lead, and I couldn't move. He got out of the front seat and opened the back doors of the van, then repeated, "Get in the van, or else." Luckily for me, just in that moment, I heard a man's voice yell from the hotel right next to us. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The creepy guy told the man to mind his own business. Another guy from across the street started to confront him as well. When he turned around to tell this man to shut up, too, I booked it. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my entire life. Somehow, I made it back to campus, crying and gasping for air while people stared at me like I was a lunatic. I told campus security, who took down all the details and told me they would look into it, but I never got another update. After this, people, please be aware of your surroundings. Don't be like me and believe that just because it's daylight, nothing bad can happen to you. This night started off in the city but ended deep in the woods. I just wanted to put that out there for context. I'm going to obscure the locations for personal safety. I'm originally from the Northeast, but I couldn't stand the winters, so I went south for college. Because of this, I was enrolled in my first year of university in the southern part of the US. The university was in a small city town, and going out to drink was the main thing everyone did. I was out with some guy friends playing pool at a small dive bar when an older guy walked up to us and started talking. He asked if he could get in on a game. I'll refer to him as Brian. I was 22 at the time, and this guy looked quite a bit older, probably in his late 30s or so. We played a few games, and he mentioned a bonfire party happening just outside of town. He said some girls he worked with were hosting it and asked if we wanted to go with him. My friends declined, but I was single at the time, so I said, sure. Why not? As we left the parking lot in his truck, he said we needed to swing by his apartment to grab some liquor. This is when things got weird. I remember getting in the car, pulling out of the lot, and then pulling up to an apartment complex on the very outskirts of town. The bar was in the downtown area, and we were now far away on the outskirts. I wondered if I had nodded off on the ride because I couldn't even remember the drive there. I started questioning myself when he said he would go inside, get the booze, take a shower, and change his clothes. He offered for me to come inside. The inside was completely empty, no furniture, nothing hanging on the walls, just completely open, empty rooms, almost like a model home. He didn't even comment on it, though. I asked him if he had just moved in or something. He gave me a weird look, then walked back into the bathroom without saying anything else. I thought about just leaving in that moment when I heard him get into the shower. Something about this situation was really starting to creep me out. I was sizing him up in my head and thought I could at least take him if some weird stuff went down. I remembered him mentioning the girls and the bonfire, so I decided to hang around and see where the night went. His shower stopped, and he walked out wearing different clothes. A few minutes later, he had 2 bottles of whiskey with him and looked at me. "Ready?" We jumped back in his truck and pulled out. I made a very conscious effort to stay alert. We left the city limits and headed outside of town on a dark back road. We were still on a main road, but now we were very far away from town. The closest city I knew of was an hour away in the opposite direction. There were fewer and fewer houses as we drove along. The places I did see looked like decrepit old shacks that had been abandoned for years. I had lived here for a few months, but I had never been out this far. We drove for even longer, so far, in fact, that a few times I had to ask if he knew where he was going. We were in the middle of nowhere. Now, no houses at all, just thick woods on both sides of the road. I didn't see him reading any directions or maps or anything. I saw a small parking lot, a gas station, and a turnoff. A lone street light lit the station, only 2 pumps, and they looked ancient. A red neon sign said, 24 hours. We turned off onto this side street and kept driving. This road was even worse than the main road we'd just been on, no lights at all, very narrow. It twisted and turned, snaking through the woods. No houses at all, but I would occasionally see a rotting old mailbox. Every once in a while, we came to the top of a hill where there was a driveway. I again asked if he knew where he was going, and he just chuckled to himself. I was now in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, with a guy I realized I didn't know at all. Fear started to creep in when we finally arrived at a destination. It was not a house. In fact, it looked like a garage or some sort of industrial building. No lighting inside or around it. No motion lights as we drove up, no cars or other people. "Where's the bonfire?" I made my tone as direct as possible. "Just back through the woods," he said. We drove past this decrepit building, around the back, and towards the woods. As we got closer, I could see a very small path, so small, the branches scraped along the truck's side. After what seemed like forever, the trail opened into a clearing. I could see a few other trucks and people. Relief washed over me. I grew up in the city and wasn't used to stuff like this, so I started to think that maybe I was just being paranoid and needed to calm down a bit. It was past midnight now. We had left the bar around 10, so it felt good to finally leave that car. I scanned the whole group, but could only see a few girls. A couple of guys were building a fire and trying to get it going. There were about 25 to 30 people here. A guy who was introduced as Mike walked up to us to greet Brian, but he stared at me the whole time. He never once stopped staring at me. In fact, they were all staring at me. Brian said he needed to take a piss and walked off. Mike asked if I wanted a beer. He said to hang tight and walked away. He came back and handed me an open bottle. I said, "Thanks," and tried to initiate some small talk, but he simply turned around and walked away. I started to look around, and now I could see something was really off here. There was no music playing, no lights, nobody was even talking to each other. The people at this party seemed diverse in age. I wondered how these people even knew each other. They were all just standing together, mumbling. Each time I approached a group of people, they would simply stop talking and turn to stare at me. It was extremely uncomfortable. I found myself standing alone with everyone looking at me, just waiting for Brian to come back. I couldn't see him anywhere. I looked around for his truck too, but now I couldn't find that either. I had just about had enough of this weird stuff and was now ready to go. I kept scanning around, looking for his truck, but it wasn't there. I hadn't heard any vehicle start or go while I was walking around. I turned back towards the bonfire now, seeing everyone standing together, looking at me once more. All 30 people were now in one grouping, and they just stood there, completely silent, unmoving. They just stared at me. The bonfire glowed behind the group, making the moment feel surreal. As I stood there awkwardly, I started noticing their faces were changing. Their expressions rapidly shifted from smiling to frowning. Their eyes went wide, and they snarled at me. But once I focused on them, their faces immediately went back to blank and expressionless. Suddenly, they began to walk toward me at a deliberate pace. I turned around and ran. I ran up the path, out of the clearing, as fast as I could. My adrenaline was surging, and I kept running. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me or any vehicles now, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to put as much distance as possible between them and me. I started to panic as the trail broke off and went different ways. I didn't remember that from driving in, but I kept running all the same. Finally, I saw that industrial building through the trees and felt a bit of relief. I stopped just before the edge of the trail. It was late fall, so it was quite brisk out, but now I was burning up. I was wearing flannel and jeans with boots, not exactly great for running. I was sweating like a pig and really needed to catch my breath. The light from the bonfire was not visible anymore through the thick woods. As I crossed the lot and passed the industrial building toward the paved road, lights came on inside. A second wind of adrenaline took hold, and I ran towards the paved road and kept running. My feet felt like lead, and my legs were burning, but I ran as hard as I could. I finally got too tired and moved into the brush to hide and catch my breath. I couldn't see any headlights, so I went back to the side of the road and began jogging. I was on high alert, glancing all around me. When I finally reached the end of the road, which connected back to the main road and the gas station, I went inside. An old guy sat at the counter, watching a small TV. He noticed I looked quite haggard and asked if I was all right. I told him I needed to use a phone. He laughed and asked where I had come from. I told him I had been out at a party in the woods and just gotten ditched. He gave me a strange look and gestured toward the phone on the wall. I could see he had a gun on his hip, and he probably thought I was a tweaker come to rob him or something. There was a phone book, so I called a taxi to come pick me up. An hour later, I was back in my dorm room and went to sleep. I never did see Brian again. I drove by his apartment complex plenty of times, but never saw his truck parked there. I never saw it around town or back at the bar either. I remember because it was an off-white single-cab Chevy, late 80s model, with a skull sticker on the back window and Roman numerals on the forehead. My curiosity got the better of me a few times, and I drove out toward that small gas station. I followed the road to where the shop was and found it. I drove out a couple of times, and each time there was no one there, and it looked completely abandoned. The building looked even shittier in the daytime. I left and drove back to town. I have no idea what to make of the events of that night. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.